But so I'm here today. We're switching tracks a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about quantitative data because that's the area of my expertise. And I'm also a media effects scholar, so I'm going to start by talking a little bit about media. And a lot of us in the room, I hope, remember this era of media where we had 3 broadcast channels, right? Unfortunately, and we know, a lot of us know, right, we're far beyond this. What we have today looks much more like this. And this is, again, a very small sampling of what we see today in media. And this we mostly see online, right? The advent of information technologies, the internet have allowed us to become more fragmented, and it mirrors this broader cultural trend of being more individualized, right? We think about everything as being picked for me, and I can individualize, everything now, okay? And so we have a trend in media that follows this. And, as we look at information about science and technology, these are data from the National Science Board that's put out by the NSF every 2 years by actually one of our quantitative colleagues, John Besley, that works on this. But, we see that people, at least Americans, are going far more online for information and news about science and technology. And in 2014, right, the highest ever percentage of Americans, 67% of Americans, 2/3 of Americans went online if they needed information about any type of science or technology. Okay, so this is the space that people are turning to for information. And, so these fragmented spaces, fragmented media spaces, don't necessarily cause polarization, but we certainly see polarization, right? And one of the potential arguments for that is we have all these sort of individualized places where we go to. I don't have to see what's on Fox News, right? Conservative folks don't have to see what's on MSNBC and so on, so we lack all these shared media experiences. And, we also see at the same time a lot of these opinion gaps, right? Not only in media, but also mirrored among populations, among Americans, right? So we see, so here's a chart, information from the Pew Research Center, and this shows you the percent of Americans who agree that each one of these is a top priority, right, for America's energy policies. And you can see that there is a large partisan divide on a lot of these. And so, we're here talking about energy democracy, and we spent most of yesterday thinking about what is energy democracy. And a few of the keywords that I took, first of all, from the website of this, right, that we started with is sort of this democratic, community-driven prosumers, decentralized energy systems, renewable, sustainable, local energy, and also social justice, right? And if we focus on that first one, then we should really care about public opinion and what people think, right, about energy and energy democracy and decentralized systems and social justice and so on. And so, thinking about what public opinion is on these issues is really, in a lot of cases, an empirical question, right? And so in my public opinion work, I think of public opinion as Walter Lippmann sort of thinks about it, right, as the pictures inside our heads, is a phrase that he uses, and the collection of individual pictures in our heads as constituting public opinion. And so, when we think about public opinion in science or technological issues like energy, nuclear power, a lot of this is characterized by a sort of public understanding of science that's based on science literacy. And Dr. McFarland yesterday mentioned this when she talked about engagers, right? It always, well, for the sort of technical experts, this idea of the deficit model always seems to be an eye-opening, it's not about information. It's not because, the publics don't understand the science I do and they have a deficit of information and a deficit of knowledge. And so in order to make their attitudes better, right, I just fill the deficit, right? And we saw her talk about that when she talked about these engagers around energy. And so a lot of, public opinion in science has traditionally been sort of prefaced on this deficit model, right? We just need to fill the deficit as experts. Well, research tells us that doesn't work. A lot of research tells us that doesn't work, which is sort of why it's surprising to me that we rediscover this every time when we think about a different scientific or technological issue, right? And there are other reasons why it doesn't work. Publics, we have limited knowledge and frameworks to understand a lot of scientific and technological issues, right? So again, these are data from the National Science Board. 53% of Americans can define a randomized experiment. Only 26% of Americans understand the concept of a scientific study, right? So if you're like an optimist, you're looking at this going, yes, half of Americans can do this. And OK, I don't know how to make the second point optimistic. So we'll just skip that. And the other thing is that we are also chronically distracted, right? And this, again, is sort of a result of having these online and mobile technologies that we can go to. Okay, it's just very distracting space. Not that many people choose, nobody's listening to me now, but not that many people opt to go search for information on science and technology, right? And deliberately expose themselves to this information, which is what you have to do now. Yeah, speakers top that. One more thing. Most of us, right, we all think, yes, knowledge is the thing, and education is going to solve that. But most of us actually don't encounter that much science throughout our time in the educational system. Okay, so here's just a graph from Physics Today, and it shows the lifespan in years on the x-axis, the time of the day on the y, and then the months of the year, right? So the box represents the average lifespan of an American, and you can see how much time is spent in K through 12 and in college. And a trickle of that is science education, right? The statistics on how many college undergraduates actually enroll in one science course is quite depressing, right? It's 30% of undergraduates will ever enroll in one course about science. That then become adults and vote, right? And make decisions about energy and other scientific regulatory issues. But the rest of the space, right, where we find information is through media. Okay, we encounter a lot of information about science through media, and now through social media. And so if we sort of switch gears back again to public opinion, there are already some public opinion data that can inform a research agenda on energy democracy, right? A lot of secondary data exist that, aren't necessarily directly, they're not saying, yeah, I'm going to study energy democracy and that's what I'm going to measure. They're studying issues related to energy democracy, and we can use that as insights, right? So the National Opinion Research Center, NORC at the University of Chicago is one of these. In 2012, they collected survey data asking folks, how much responsibility do you think each of the following groups share for increasing energy savings in the United States, right? And so the light bars are those who said, well, a large amount or a lot, and then moderate and only a little, okay? And so then there are these various groups. So information like this that's already available can inform, right, a research agenda that we're trying to build in energy democracy. And there's also a lot of primary data, right? A lot of these by colleagues who are in the room. Most of this is survey data. These data exist. We just need to mine these data. I like data. I really like data. We need to mine these data to answer some of the empirical questions about energy democracy, right? And of course, I don't think anyone here is like, yeah, she's saying that if you just mine these data, you'll answer all the research questions about energy democracy. Okay, I'm not saying that. But here's a place to start, right? Low-hanging fruit, data already collected. Get in touch with these folks. But of course, there's challenges with public opinion research. This slide isn't all that interesting to most of us, I think, but representative sampling, right? We have to do this correctly if we're going to do it, okay? Thinking about who we're trying to make inferences and generalizations about when we sample, when we ask survey questions, right? And a lot of this has to do with probability sampling techniques, so on. That is very much related to resources, right? There have to be resources to do this kind of empirical work. And then, mobile and online technologies, the other thing that it's sort of done for us is it's made low response rates an even bigger challenge than it used to be, right? Survey researchers used to be able to dial landlines and get geographic places. My cell phone number is from Hawaii. I used to live in Hawaii, so, I have an 808 number in Utah. So nobody's dialing my number randomly and trying to get somebody in Hawaii, right? Or at least if they are, they're not getting someone in Hawaii. But we should also think about data sources, methods maybe that complement opinion surveys that we have, right? So things like content analysis. I mentioned, and I started with media here. I think it's important, thank you, to think about what types of information and how that information is framed, right, that people are being exposed to as well. So studying what, shows up in media about energy, and maybe specifically about energy democracy is going to be important, right? We can use network analysis to map our stakeholders, right? Map the conversations between stakeholders, groups of stakeholders. And then taking advantage of these sort of new spaces, right? Jen, yesterday I think you mentioned when you were talking about the alt-right, 4chan and Reddit. These are very new spaces for research that we haven't yet explored. Also, search engines, I think, are a really interesting place to go, because if people are going online for information, chances are, I'm on a really squeaky board right here. Chances are they're going to be searching for that information, right? And so what search information algorithms display for people is going to be different depending on where they are, depending on what they've clicked on, right? So what kinds of analysis can we think about that are related to search engines or social media that might help build this research agenda in energy democracy? And then I wrote this yesterday on this poster board here, that I think what is really important, especially in something like energy, is the intersection of research and practice, that we have practice-informed research, right, and vice versa. And of course, this necessarily involves collaborations, but the great part about this is that we get practical outcomes from this, but we also can ask theoretical questions about it based on practice, right? And then we've mentioned multiple times communication and engagement between stakeholders, and some of us here have mentioned this, but what I think is really important is evaluating those communications and the type of public engagement that happens, right? Quite often, at least in a lot of sort of science-related issues, we think of communication, public communication, and public engagement, and then we forget to evaluate the nature of those communications. But there are people out there who do this, right? We just need to sort of, hey, come hang out with us. And so with my last couple of minutes, I'm actually going to try to move away from energy for a moment, just to give you an example of how I have used these different methods in a project. And the project itself is about microbiomes and disgust. I think it's really cool because in my former life, I used to be a microbial oceanographer, so I studied bacteria. But microbiomes are basically the communities of bacteria that live in or on surfaces. People, right? We have gut microbiota. You probably have seen in the news recently about its relation to obesity and things like that, but they live everywhere. Okay, and so I used three things. I did survey data, thinking about asking people about what their perceptions of risks and benefits are related to microbiomes, and whether they support regulation, right? Support for the technology itself or the research. I did a content analysis, right? Thinking about, well, what do people encounter when they go online to look for information about microbiomes? What topics are covered? And then I ran an experiment as well, thinking about, it's bacteria. People are going to be kind of disgusted, right? When you think about microbiomes and you think about the human microbiome, the thing that comes up most is feces, right? So disgust is a very discrete emotion that, using an experiment, we can probe more theoretical links. I also used some secondary data. Here's some results from a Google Scholar search of articles with the keywords microbiomes. You can see sort of the increase, right, in the number of research articles that occur. And then with survey data, so I'm just going to give you some examples of the results of some of these various methods. And this is a question about how much do you agree with the statement that academic research on the microbiome should be regulated, right? And for folks who are interested, we can talk about the sample or whatever offline, but we can get opinions, right, about all of this. And for the most part, people are kind of in the middle. They do not agree nor disagree with this. With a content analysis, so we looked at what topics were covered about microbiomes, because as I mentioned, they live, right, in us, they live on us, they live in our built environment. There's bacteria on the surface. They live in plants and animals as well. And so, thinking about what is most covered in media when we look at these scientific and technological issues, right? And not that surprisingly, human health is often the most covered area. And then experiments, right? Probing more theoretical links between various things that you can measure, and this experiment itself was embedded in the survey. So what we did was we showed people 2 different articles, right, in 2 groups, one that was designed to elicit disgust and one not, and then we asked them a series of questions following that. Okay, and so I think, that obviously doesn't have to do anything with energy democracy, but let's get back to that, right? So I think when we're thinking about building a research agenda, some of the questions that we might ask are, how is information about these issues communicated, right? And how do these communications then influence our audience perceptions? Because a lot of our stakeholders are members of the public as well, right? So we need to know what they think about this if we are sort of truly in this wanting an ideal democratic way, right? And so, things that we could do, content analysis, network analysis, and then the various types of primary and secondary data collection related to survey research. Thank you.